Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. The strange show taking different albums in of all sorts, shapes and sizes and generated discussion by creating these weird videos for them, I guess. It's a rather strange show. So today, we of course have an unusual album for you all indeed. What we essentially have here is kind of a freeform experimental jazz album, I guess, but the thing is, this album really doesn't adhere to any rules or conventions of genre and stuff. It seems to just interpolate whatever experimental notions it feels works best at the time to create this, roughly half-hour experience of just very varying musical ideas, from menacing drones to head-spinning curiosity. Really weird, bit difficult to summarize, so I think the best course of action is to just get straight into today's video. Today, I present Trun'zoyl'zl by Rob Michalchuk. So of course, let's ask ourselves, who is Rob Michalchuk? Well, Rob Michalchuk is a performer and composer based out of Brantford, Ontario, I think, not too sure. Anyway, having been active in the music scene since 1993, Michalchuk has churned out, this very chunky discography of experimental releases, delving into the worlds of electronic, jazz, spoken word, even the experimental. And having played in a large number of different bands over the years, it also seems that at some point, when who knows, Michalchuk also formed the record label Poor Little Music, who've churned out a plethora of very affordable releases on both cassette and even floppy disks. And so today we are of course reviewing Trun'zoyl'zl, no idea how it's said, sorry, a 2-track experimental album that was released in a limited run of 30 copies on Christmas Day in 2022, which I guess makes this a Christmas album? Maybe, bit of a stretch. But yeah, released on the experimental label Econore, a fascinating record label that focuses on experimental music and all kinds of weird stuff. Perfect for the show, right? I'll say here, this is genuinely a record label that I'm eager to dive into a bunch more in a future episode, but that's for another day. Today, we are looking at Trun'zoyl'zl. And this album, very peculiar experience of saxophone drones offset by strange frequencies, squelching electronics, and the confusing, battering experience of, I guess, field recordings on the final track. Like I said, very excited to discuss this bizarre and free-flowing album that's also weirdly heavy as well, but we'll get into that a bit later. So let's discuss it, shall we? And so, opening up with its title track of Trun'zoyl'zl, we're immediately greeted to such an ominous and foreboding soundscape with these low-end grunts and grumbles from the saxophone, before the resonant ringing of higher notes just float into the composition, creating such a weird atmosphere that feels so peculiar to begin with. And what I like immediately is how there's almost a heaviness to the composition as it starts itself off, one that is really slow as it's pushed by those repeating loops, accompanied by much longer drones of the saxophone itself. And I admire that heavy style that it offers up, because it seems to arguably become all the more intense the more this particular composition, just moves itself along. And especially with the use of looper effects, it just allows Michalchuk to just add to the ever-growing onslaught that this composition is offering, further pushing us into the realms of horror as almost these droning saxophones create such an unsettling atmosphere. It's the sheer fact that music like this just easily places me in that state of mind that I find really fascinating, though. But also, it's something about the way the saxophone sounds on this record that just ends up being really amazing as well. It results in something that's very foreboding, especially when it becomes treated with all these different effects, the more the composition develops, incorporating frequencies, drones, and even I'm pretty sure the tapping of the saxophone at times as well, which just creates more low end and lowercase for the songs to just indulge in. Very weirdly, a little bit reminiscent of Colin Stetson at times, but this feels way more experimental and not just limited to the saxophone, but a bunch of other instruments, I believe, as well, to actually just reach out and incorporate more ideas. To further discuss this track, what I find interesting is how the more it all develops, the more instances of different sounds we get within the composition. And after a while, it becomes more and more difficult to really discern the identity of a lot of these sounds, it feels. And all we can go on is just the vibe being presented by the music itself. And, for me, it further pushes the songs into realms of fear and confusion. But I also like certain passages from the saxophone that play from time to time, and they end up having this incredibly unusual and weird film noir aesthetic, I think, but one that is so blurred and clouded within the very soundscape itself, as though our private investigator has stumbled upon something they should not have wandered into. And as a result, we are now forced to witness the cataclysmic events of everything happening all around them as they are pulled into that very miasma itself. As weird, oddly scary and foreboding as it all is, there is just something so incredibly cool about the way it all sounds though, which even indulges in the glorious qualities of the saxophone itself, of course, though it is one that is accompanied by the most fear-instilling vibes I've come across, especially on this song. I'd argue that it is perhaps a bit of a challenging listen at times, especially as all that chaos, confusion and distortion seems to build and build the more this particular track progresses. But the sheer fact that this composition can, so clearly express such vibes rather concisely, it makes for an incredibly fascinating experience in its own right, I feel. Heavy metal in the form of saxophone performances. A little bit weird, but to be fair, little tangent time here, but the saxophone has always been one of my favourite instruments, but it was actually only when I discovered the works of Colin Stetson that I began to realise how heavy this instrument can sound. And it's perhaps why I enjoy this particular album so much, though, as it further an investigation into the very notion of the heavy saxophone sound. Loud, intense, a bit overbearing to be witnessed to, but an incredibly amazing experience in my books, though. Especially with how chaotic and noisy this whole composition becomes, it just ends up being such a unique listening experience that utilises so many different aspects, of the saxophone as an instrument, leaning on the use of pedals, I assume, and loops to bring out so much more from the instruments as well. Truly amazing in my books, and something I actually genuinely love to hear, even though it does set my heart racing from time to time. Like some sort of eldritch being emerging from the shadow that pulls into the underworld, and you're just there, it's like, well, I can't do anything about this now. Anyway, so of course, flipping this over, you do get another composition on the other side, the second track of Pidos. And so if you thought that the first track could be any help for what we're getting ourselves in for, I'm afraid you're wrong, as Pidos seems to do its own thing entirely, irrespective of everything that has just occurred here. From the onset, you're getting garbled vocals attempting to communicate in amongst this noise, accompanied by the most skronked out, highest passages of saxophone just resonating with such odd frequencies. And it then becomes immediately apparent that these vocal passages, vocal samples, vocal field record, whatever you want to call it, it seems to be that these are the inclusion of answering machines, continuing to play their just, normal messages as Michalchuk just improvises over the top of it all, creating a really confusing soundscape that feels even more weirder than the previous tracks at this point. To me, it's perhaps between the contrast of those answering machine messages alongside the intermittent squeal and whine from the saxophone that makes it such a peculiar contrast in my opinion, though. The odd normalcy of the people chatting and talking to each other, backed up by the answering machine noises, creates such an unusual, broken and distorted tapestry that feels like it's attempting to reach out into the real world, only to come across so differently and so chaotically as simply cannot exist in this same space, if that makes any sense. But as mentioned, so fascinating. The compositional choice to create such a weird soundscape of saxophone loops and noise and contrast it with the normal human speech of sorts, really interesting in my books, especially with how those incredibly weird musical soundscapes just flows in for these long droning passages, completely overloading those vocal samples. It becomes so weird at points when it all just dies down, leaving the continuing playing of the message occur for a couple of moments, letting us capture a portion of what it is they're saying and discussing. However, it's then contrasted, by the overload of the musical side, where it just brings back the instrumentals tenfold, and then your brain gets overloaded, so you just can't comprehend what's going on. And then it goes back to quiet moments, which creates a really unusual effect, I've noticed. So especially with that onslaught of the instrumentals, when it all fades down, your brain is still scrambled and fried by the whole thing. And so when it gets to a quieter moment where you can actually hear what's being said, I feel like maybe it's just my brain, but it's very difficult to comprehend what they're saying at this time because you're just so battered by what it is you're experiencing, if that makes sense. And I feel like you kind of just have to let the whole thing just do its own thing, as you attempt to form some semblance of understanding within the confusion and the delirium. What's kind of funny and amusing though, all that confusion noise, suddenly, just giving way, leaving, there is a bit where the saxophone just plays for a few brief moments as it continues to play such skronked out notes that have no form or structure, as the lute beeps of the answering machine continue alongside it. And then, weirdly enough, devolving back into that chaotic, noisy deluge, opting for incredibly experimental passages where even the vocals start to sound distorted at times as well, and in amongst the musical motifs almost, if you can call them those. It's confusing, chaotic again, but very fascinating that the whole composition is just morphing and changing in these very little ways, it feels. And then what I like is, towards the end though, I think it's towards the end, you do get, the occurrence of various messages from one single person attempting to contact their friend, who simply isn't picking up their phone, it seems, and much to their annoyance, because their answering machine is broken apparently. And it's funny because we get to hear progression of this, and it's quite clear in the mix as the skronked out saxophone doesn't sing, of course. And you can just hear the mild annoyance turn into sort of like an unbridled fury. And it's so weirdly funny, and a very amazing way to end the album, I have to say. A couple more tangents though. I have to say, it's very difficult to summarise the true breadth of this entire album from start to finish. I just feel like the whole thing is such a sonic overload that it's very difficult to comprehend even what's happening at times. Especially in the album's first half, where everything feels so dark and foreboding. And I'll be honest, I don't think anything gets any easier in the second track, but it's amazingly just interesting in its own right, of course. And as noisy, chaotic, confusing as the whole thing is, there's something weirdly fun about it all for some strange reason that I can't really quite put my finger on, but maybe it's just the amusing nature of those answering machines. I have to say, it might be, this is one of those albums as well, where I'm always discovering new different details every time I hear it, especially as it, it concisely transports those strange landscapes. You just notice new details in amongst everything you're hearing, if that makes sense. And, with how much has gone into this, it's so weird and fascinating to hear these little bits that come out, if that makes sense. So, another tangent time. So, something I briefly wanted to mention, but to go back to the use of answering machines on the second track, I have a bit of story time here. So, years ago, when I used to live in London, our old bassist Rory and myself met up to make some skronky drone music. The result was a weird improvisational composition that features a lot of heavy guitars and heavy bass, before retreating into this incredibly abstract drone of minor sound instances where I'm pretty sure I was playing an Allen key on the strings down by the pickups and scratching the strings at times. In any case though, we ended up with a very long recording here, and I decided to cobble it all together into a sort of more experimental release. And one thing I did, during that very lengthy middle section, I took a long recording of an answering machine message and then attached it to the quieter part. And I always liked how it sounded, because one thing I did was loop the repeated bit of the answering machine's beeps and tones, and then the message of the time that the answering machine was playing. And it just plays ad nauseum in a sort of spiralling down the drain hole. But I always thought it was particularly cool, even though it was incredibly weird. Just a little bit of fun messing around with audio, of course. And hearing the second track on this album, Pidos, it reminded me so much of that little jam session, the project was fun, nothing really came of it, but I just remember how much fun it was jamming around, and then also making that music, and adding that answering machine stuff. And I think as well, with how weird that middle section was, adding the answering machine made it a lot easier to listen to and give it a sense of narrative. Helping to give that improvisation, a bit of an easier structure, if that makes sense. And I think maybe that's why Michalchuk chose to done it here as well. He sort of gives a sense of narrative in amongst very strange soundscapes, if that makes sense. And to be fair, I thought this sort of parallel between these two little instances, I just thought it was a bit interesting, even though it's a bit weird, so I just thought I'd quickly mention it. The same idea, same creative idea, cropping up in different contexts is one way to put it, I guess. So, to go back to the album, I have to say, an incredibly weird one to try and digest. So many aspects of this album, to this day, still confuse and confound me, but within it, it's what I find truly fascinating about it all, as well as the fact that there's such a heaviness to the two compositions as well. And it's such an incredible build-up of intensity and chaos, all expressed through the abstract performance of the saxophone, mixing with very unusual effects from time to time. And it's certainly strange, right? But it's really interesting to me, and as well, I can't help but imagine Michalchuk having so much fun improvising to his heart's content, just performing the wonky saxophones, utilising it on this very album to create something so weird and unique, though, as a result. A weird landscape for us to just inhabit for 30 minutes as we get stunned into a fried status that is strangely familiar in a completely unknown world. And so with that, I think we'll be coming to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. Another weird video for the Weird Cassettes playlist, It's funny, it's a very growing playlist. It's a funny point as well. Never actually been a fan of this format, which is probably very difficult to imagine by now. But since making this show as it was, I've been discovering more and more incredibly strange releases on the cassette format. And this, it's just so much fun to dive into because you get some of the most bizarre things occurring on cassette. And this is one that just really piques my curiosity, when I'm hearing it again and again now. I'm always noticing new details, as I mentioned. But I also just love those heavy sounds produced in this album. They're just loop, process, overlaid with live improvisations of sorts, and just making for a very weird, strange, unique listening experience that just bombards you. Very fascinating to me, and a very cool little thing to have into my ever-growing cassette collection as well, I should say. Another one for the playlist. In any case, I would like to thank you for watching this episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.